In this video, we bring you a collection of 3 of Agatha Christie's most captivating tales, each one packed with unexpected secrets and mind-boggling puzzles. First, we travel to a quiet Cornish village, where a seemingly peaceful vacation quickly unravels into a deadly game. Can a family heirloom really be the key to an unsolved mystery? Then, prepare for a deliciously dark treat when a box of chocolates becomes the center of a crime, and one sweet bite could lead to deadly consequences. Finally, we head to the remote hunter's lodge, where a simple invitation for a weekend getaway turns into a chilling encounter. Someone's hiding a secret, and it's far more dangerous than anyone could imagine. How do these shocking events connect? Trust me, you won't want to miss the spine-tingling twists that tie them all together.
The Cornish mystery reflects Agatha Christie's recurring theme of domestic crimes, where the tension and danger lie close to home. Published in 1932, the story captures the growing anxiety of the interwar period, when fears of betrayal and secrecy within the household mirrored the uncertainties of the larger world. Christie's use of poison as the murder weapon is particularly notable, as it reflects her knowledge of toxicology. She had worked as a pharmacy assistant during World War I. This expertise in poisons is a hallmark of her detective stories, and Poirot's meticulous investigation into Mrs. Pengelly's death showcases Christie's intricate plotting and deep understanding of human nature. Agatha Christie, The Cornish Mystery. "Mrs. Pengelly," announced our landlady, and withdrew discreetly. Many unlikely people came to consult Poirot, but to my mind, the woman who stood nervously just inside the door, fingering her feather neckpiece, was the most unlikely of all. She was so extraordinarily commonplace, a thin, faded woman of about 50, dressed in a braided coat and skirt, some gold jewellery at her neck, and with her grey hair surmounted by a singularly unbecoming hat. In a country town you pass 100 Mrs. Pengellys in the street every day. Poirot came forward and greeted her pleasantly, perceiving her obvious embarrassment. "Madame, take a chair, I beg of you. My colleague, Captain Hastings." The lady sat down, murmuring uncertainly, "You are Monsieur Poirot, the detective?" "At your service, madame." But our guest was still tongue-tied. She sighed, twisted her fingers, and grew steadily redder and redder. "There is something I can do for you, eh, madame?" "Well, I thought, that is, you see—" "Proceed, madame, I beg of you. Proceed." Mrs. Pengelly, thus encouraged, took a grip on herself. "It's this way, Monsieur Poirot. I don't want to have anything to do with the police. No, I wouldn't go to the police for anything. But all the same, I'm sorely troubled about something. And yet, I don't know if I ought—" She stopped abruptly. "Me, I have nothing to do with the police. My investigations are strictly private." Mrs. Pengelly caught at the word. "Private. That's what I want. I don't want any talk or fuss or things in the papers. Wicked it is, the way they write things, until the family could never hold up their heads again. And it isn't as though I was even sure. It's just a dreadful idea that's come to me, and put it out of my head I can't." She paused for breath. "And all the time I may be wickedly wronging poor Edward. It's a terrible thought for any wife to have, but you do read of such dreadful things nowadays. Permit me, it is of your husband you speak?" "Yes." "And you suspect him of—" "What?" "I don't like even to say it, Monsieur Poirot. But you do read of such things happening, and the poor souls suspecting nothing." I was beginning to despair of the lady's ever coming to the point, but Poirot's patience was equal to the demand made upon it. "Speak without fear, madame. Think what joy will be yours if we are able to prove your suspicions unfounded." "That's true. Anything's better than this wearing uncertainty. Oh, Monsieur Poirot, I'm dreadfully afraid I'm being poisoned." "What makes you think so?" Mrs. Pengelly, her reticence leaving her, plunged into a full recital more suited to the ears of her medical attendant. "Pain and sickness after food, eh?" said Poirot thoughtfully. "You have a doctor attending you, madame. What does he say?" "He says it's acute gastritis, Monsieur Poirot, but I can see that he's puzzled and uneasy, and he's always altering the medicine, but nothing does any good." You have spoken of your fears to him? No, indeed, Monsieur Poirot. It might get about in the town, and perhaps it is gastritis. All the same, it's very odd that whenever Edward is away for the weekend, I'm quite all right again. Even Frida notices that. My niece, Monsieur Poirot. And then there's that bottle of weed killer, never used, the gardener says, and yet it's half empty. She looked appealingly at Poirot. He smiled reassuringly at her and reached for a pencil and notebook. Let us be businesslike, madame. Now then, you and your husband reside— where? Polgarwyth, a small market town in Cornwall. You have lived there long? 14 years. And your household consists of you and your husband? Any children? No. But a niece, I think you said? Yes, Frida Stanton, the child of my husband's only sister. She has lived with us for the last 8 years. That is, until a week ago. Oh. And what happened a week ago? Things hadn't been very pleasant for some time. I don't know what had come over Frida. She was so rude and impertinent, and her temper something shocking. And in the end she flared up one day, and out she walked and took rooms of her own in the town. I've not seen her since. Better leave her to come to her senses, so Mr. Radnor says. Who is Mr. Radnor? Some of Mrs. Pengelly's initial embarrassment returned. Oh, he's just a friend. Very pleasant young fellow. Anything between him and your niece? Nothing whatever, said Mrs. Pengelly emphatically. Poirot shifted his ground. You and your husband are, I presume, in comfortable circumstances? Yes, we're very nicely off. The money, is it yours or your husband's? Oh, it's all Edward's. I've nothing of my own. You see, madame, to be businesslike, we must be brutal. We must seek for a motive. Your husband, he would not poison you just pour passer le temps. Do you know of any reason why he should wish you out of the way? There's the yellow-haired hussy who works for him, said Mrs. Pengelly with a flash of temper. My husband's a dentist, Monsieur Poirot, and nothing would do but he must have a smart girl, as he said, with bobbed hair and a white overall, to make his appointments and mix his fillings for him. It's come to my ears that there have been fine goings-on, though of course he swears it's all right. This bottle of weed killer, madame, who ordered it? My husband, about a year ago. Your niece now, has she any money of her own? About £50 a year, I should say. She'd be glad enough to come back and keep house for Edward if I left him. You have contemplated leaving him, then? I don't intend to let him have it all his own way. Women aren't the downtrodden slaves they were in the old days, Monsieur Poirot. I congratulate you on your independent spirit, madame, but let us be practical. You return to Polgarwyth today? Yes, I came up by an excursion. 6 this morning the train started, and the train goes back at 5 this afternoon. Bien. I have nothing of great moment on hand. I can devote myself to your little affair. Tomorrow I shall be in Polgarwyth. Shall we say that Hastings, here, is a distant relative of yours, the son of your second cousin? Me, I am his eccentric foreign friend. In the meantime, eat only what is prepared by your own hands or under your eye. You have a maid whom you trust. Jessie is a very good girl, I'm sure. Till tomorrow, then, madame, and be of good courage. Poirot bowed the lady out and returned thoughtfully to his chair. His absorption was not so great, however, that he failed to see 2-minute strands of feather scarf wrenched off by the lady's agitated fingers. He collected them carefully and consigned them to the wastepaper basket. What do you make of the case, Hastings? A nasty business, I should say. Yes, if what the lady suspects be true. But is it? Woe betide any husband who orders a bottle of weed killer nowadays. If his wife suffers from gastritis and is inclined to be of a hysterical temperament, the fat is in the fire. You think that is all there is to it? Ah, voilà. I do not know, Hastings. But the case interests me. It interests me enormously. For you see, it has positively no new features. Hence the hysterical theory. And yet Mrs. Pengelly did not strike me as being a hysterical woman. Yes, if I mistake not, we have here a very poignant human drama. Tell me, Hastings, what do you consider Mrs. Pengelly's feelings towards her husband to be? Loyalty struggling with fear, I suggested. Yet, ordinarily, a woman will accuse anyone in the world, but not her husband. She will stick to her belief in him through thick and thin. The other woman complicates the matter. Yes, affection may turn to hate under the stimulus of jealousy, but hate would take her to the police, not to me. She would want an outcry, a scandal. No, no, let us exercise our little grey cells. Why did she come to me? To have her suspicions proved wrong, or to have them proved right? Ah, we have here something I do not understand, an unknown factor. Is she a superb actress, our Mrs. Pengelly? No, she was genuine. I would swear that she was genuine, and therefore I am interested. Look up the trains to Polgarwyth, I pray you. The best train of the day was the 1:50 from Paddington, which reached Polgarwyth just after 7 o'clock. The journey was uneventful, and I had to rouse myself from a pleasant nap to alight upon the platform of the bleak little station. We took our bags to the Duchy Hotel, and after a light meal, Poirot suggested our stepping round to pay an after-dinner call on my so-called cousin. The Pengelly's house stood a little way back from the road, with an old-fashioned cottage garden in front. The smell of stocks and mignonette came sweetly wafted on the evening breeze. It seemed impossible to associate thoughts of violence with this old-world charm. Poirot rang and knocked. As the summons was not answered, he rang again. This time, after a little pause, the door was opened by a dishevelled-looking servant. Her eyes were red, and she was sniffing violently. "We wish to see Mrs. Pengelly," explained Poirot. "May we enter?" The maid stared. Then, with unusual directness, she answered, "Haven't you heard, then? She's dead. Died this evening, about half an hour ago." We stood staring at her, stunned. "What did she die of?" I asked at last. "There's some as could tell." She gave a quick glance over her shoulder. "If it wasn't that somebody ought to be in the house with the missus, I'd pack my box and go tonight. But I'll not leave her dead with no one to watch by her. It's not my place to say anything, and I'm not going to say anything. But everybody knows. It's all over the town. And if Mr. Radnor don't write to the Home Secretary, someone else will. The doctor may say what he likes. Didn't I see the master with my own eyes a-lifting down of the weed-killer from the shelf this very evening? And didn't he jump when he turned round and saw me watching of him? And the Mrs. Gruel there on the table, all ready to take to her? Not another bit of food passer. It's my lips while I'm in this house, not if I dies for it." "Where does the doctor live who attended your mistress?" "Dr. Adams, round the corner in High Street, the second house." Poirot turned away abruptly. He was very pale. "For a girl who was not going to say anything, that girl said a lot," I remarked dryly. Poirot struck his clenched hand into his palm. "An imbecile, a criminal imbecile. That is what I have been, Hastings. I have boasted of my little grey cells, and now I have lost a human life, a life that came to me to be saved. Never did I dream that anything would happen so soon. May the good God forgive me, but I never believed anything would happen at all. Her story seemed to me artificial. Here we are at the doctor's. Let us see what he can tell us." Dr. Adams was the typical genial, red-faced country doctor of fiction. He received us politely enough, but at a hint of our errand, his red face became purple. Damned nonsense, every word of it. Wasn't I in attendance on the case? Gastritis pure and simple. This town's a hotbed of gossip. A lot of scandal-mongering old women get together and invent God knows what. They read these scurrilous rags of newspapers, and nothing will suit them but that someone in their town shall get poisoned too. They see a bottle of weed-killer on a shelf, and hey presto, away goes their imagination with the bit between his teeth. I know Edward Pengelly. He wouldn't poison his grandmother's dog. And why should he poison his wife? Tell me that? There is one thing, Monsieur le Docteur, that perhaps you do not know. And, very briefly, Poirot outlined the main facts of Mrs. Pengelly's visit to him. No one could have been more astonished than Dr. Adams. His eyes almost started out of his head. "God bless my soul!" he ejaculated. "The poor woman must have been mad. Why didn't she speak to me? That was the proper thing to do." "And have her fears ridiculed?" "Not at all, not at all. I hope I've got an open mind." Poirot looked at him and smiled. The physician was evidently more perturbed than he cared to admit. As we left the house, Poirot broke into a laugh. He is as obstinate as a pig, that one. He has said it is gastritis, therefore it is gastritis. All the same, he has the mind uneasy. What's our next step? A return to the inn and a night of horror upon one of your English provincial beds, mon ami. It is a thing to make pity, the cheap English bed. And tomorrow? Rien à faire. We must return to town and await developments. That's very tame, I said, disappointed. Suppose there are none? There will be, I promise you that. Our old doctor may give as many certificates as he pleases. He cannot stop several hundred tongues from wagging, and they will wag to some purpose, I can tell you that. Our train for town left at 11 the following morning. Before we started for the station, Poirot expressed a wish to see Miss Frida Stanton, the niece mentioned to us by the dead woman. We found the house where she was lodging easily enough. With her was a tall, dark young man whom she introduced in some confusion as Mr. Jacob Radnor. Miss Frida Stanton was an extremely pretty girl of the old Cornish type, dark hair and eyes and rosy cheeks. There was a flash in those same dark eyes which told of a temper that it would not be wise to provoke. "Poor auntie," she said when Poirot had introduced himself and explained his business. "It's terribly sad. I've been wishing all the morning that I'd been kinder and more patient."
"You stood a great deal, Frida," interrupted Radnor.
"Yes, Jacob, but I've got a sharp temper, I know. After all, it was only silliness on auntie's part. I ought to have just laughed and not minded. Of course, it's all nonsense her thinking that uncle was poisoning her. She was worse after any food he gave her, but I'm sure it was only from thinking about it. She made up her mind she would be, and then she was." "What was the actual cause of your disagreement, mademoiselle?" Miss Stanton hesitated, looking at Radnor. That young gentleman was quick to take the hint. "I must be getting along, Frida. See you this evening. Goodbye, gentlemen. You're on your way to the station, I suppose?" Poirot replied that we were, and Radnor departed. "You are affianced, is it not so?" demanded Poirot with a sly smile. Frida Stanton blushed and admitted that such was the case. "And that was really the whole trouble with auntie," she added. "She did not approve of the match for you." "Oh, it wasn't that so much. But you see, she—" The girl came to a stop. "Yes," encouraged Poirot gently. "It seems rather a horrid thing to say about her. Now she's dead, but you'll never understand unless I tell you. Auntie was absolutely infatuated with Jacob." "Indeed?" "Yes, wasn't it absurd? She was over 50, and he's not quite 30. But there it was. She was silly about him. I had to tell her at last that it was me he was after, and she carried on dreadfully. She wouldn't believe a word of it, and was so rude and insulting that it's no wonder I lost my temper. I talked it over with Jacob, and we agreed that the best thing to do was for me to clear out for a bit till she came to her senses. Poor auntie. I suppose she was in a queer state altogether." "It would certainly seem so. Thank you, mademoiselle, for making things so clear to me." A little to my surprise, Radnor was waiting for us in the street below. "I can guess pretty well what Frida has been telling you," he remarked. "It was a most unfortunate thing to happen, and very awkward for me, as you can imagine. I need hardly say that it was none of my doing. I was pleased at first, because I imagined the old woman was helping on things with Frida. The whole thing was absurd, but extremely unpleasant." "When are you and Miss Stanton going to be married?" "Soon, I hope. Now, Monsieur Poirot, I'm going to be candid with you. I know a bit more than Frida does. She believes her uncle to be innocent. I'm not so sure, but I can tell you one thing. I'm going to keep my mouth shut about what I do know. Let sleeping dogs lie. I don't want my wife's uncle tried and hanged for murder." "Why do you tell me all this?" "Because I've heard of you, and I know you're a clever man. It's quite possible that you might ferret out a case against him, but I put it to you. What good is that? The poor woman is past help, and she'd have been the last person to want a scandal. Why, she'd turn in her grave at the mere thought of it." "You are probably right there. You want me to hush it up, then?" That's my idea. I'll admit frankly that I'm selfish about it. I've got my way to make, and I'm building up a good little business as a tailor and outfitter. Most of us are selfish, Mr. Radnor. Not all of us admit it so freely. I will do what you ask, but I tell you frankly you will not succeed in hushing it up. Why not? Poirot held up a finger. It was market day, and we were passing the market. A busy hum came from within. The voice of the people. That is why, Mr. Radnor. Ah, we must run, or we shall miss our train. Very interesting, is it not, Hastings? Said Poirot, as the train steamed out of the station. He had taken out a small comb from his pocket, also a microscopic mirror, and was carefully arranging his moustache, the symmetry of which had become slightly impaired during our brisk run. You seem to find it so, I replied. To me it is all rather sordid and unpleasant. There's hardly any mystery about it. I agree with you. There is no mystery whatever. I suppose we can accept the girl's rather extraordinary story of her aunt's infatuation. That seemed the only fishy part to me. She was such a nice, respectable woman. There's nothing extraordinary about that. It is completely ordinary. If you read the papers carefully, you will find that often a nice, respectable woman of that age leaves a husband she has lived with for 20 years, and sometimes a whole family of children as well, in order to link her life with that of a young man considerably her junior. You admire les femmes, Hastings. You prostrate yourself before all of them who are good-looking and have the good taste to smile upon you. But psychologically, you know nothing whatever about them. In the autumn of a woman's life, there comes always one mad moment when she longs for romance, for adventure, before it is too late. It comes none the less surely to a woman because she is the wife of a respectable dentist in a country town. And you think that a clever man might take advantage of such a moment? I shouldn't call Pengelly so clever, I mused. He's got the whole town by the ears, and yet I suppose you're right. The only two men who know anything, Radnor and the doctor, both want to hush it up. He's managed that somehow. I wish we'd seen the fellow. You can indulge your wish, return by the next train, and invent an aching molar. I looked at him keenly. I wish I knew what you considered so interesting about the case. My interest is very aptly summed up by a remark of yours, Hastings. After interviewing the maid, you observed that for someone who was not going to say a word, she had said a good deal. Oh, I said doubtfully. Then I harped back to my original criticism. I wonder why you made no attempt to see Pengelly. Mon ami, I give him just 3 months. Then I shall see him for as long as I please, in the dock. For once, I thought Poirot's prognostications were going to be proved wrong. The time went by, and nothing transpired as to our Cornish case. Other matters occupied us, and I had nearly forgotten the Pengelly tragedy when it was suddenly recalled to me by a short paragraph in the paper which stated that an order to exhume the body of Mrs. Pengelly had been obtained from the Home Secretary. A few days later, and the Cornish mystery was the topic of every paper. It seemed that gossip had never entirely died down, and when the engagement of the widower to Miss Marks, his secretary, was announced, the tongues burst out again louder than ever. Finally, a petition was sent to the Home Secretary. The body was exhumed. Large quantities of arsenic were discovered, and Mr. Pengelly was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife. Poirot and I attended the preliminary proceedings. The evidence was much as might have been expected. Dr. Adams admitted that the symptoms of arsenical poisoning might easily be mistaken for those of gastritis. The Home Office expert gave his evidence. The maid, Jessie, poured out a flood of voluble information, most of which was rejected, but which certainly strengthened the case against the prisoner. Frida Stanton gave evidence as to her aunt's being worse whenever she ate food prepared by her husband. Jacob Radnor told how he had dropped in unexpectedly on the day of Mrs. Pengelly's death, and found Pengelly replacing the bottle of weed killer on the pantry shelf, Mrs. Pengelly's gruel being on the table close by. Then Miss Marks, the fair-haired secretary, was called and wept and went into hysterics and admitted that there had been passages between her and her employer, and that he had promised to marry her in the event of anything happening to his wife. Pengelly reserved his defence and was sent for trial. Jacob Radnor walked back with us to our lodgings. "You see, Mr. Radnor," said Poirot, "I was right. The voice of the people spoke, and with no uncertain voice. There was to be no hushing up of this case. "You were quite right," sighed Radnor. "Do you see any chance of his getting off?" "Well, he has reserved his defence. He may have something up the sleeves, as you English say. Come in with us, will you not?" Radnor accepted the invitation. I ordered 2 whiskies and sodas and a cup of chocolate. The last order caused consternation, and I much doubted whether it would ever put in an appearance. "Of course," continued Poirot, "I have a good deal of experience in matters of this kind, and I see only one loophole of escape for our friend." "What is it?" "That you should sign this paper." With the suddenness of a conjurer, he produced a sheet of paper covered with writing. "What is it?" "A confession that you murdered Mrs. Pengelly." There was a moment's pause. Then Radnor laughed. "You must be mad." "No, no, my friend, I am not mad. You came here, you started a little business, you were short of money. Mr. Pengelly was a man very well-to-do. You met his niece. She was inclined to smile upon you. But the small allowance that Pengelly might have given her upon her marriage was not enough for you. You must get rid of both the uncle and the aunt. Then the money would come to her, since she was the only relative. How cleverly you set about it. You made love to that plain, middle-aged woman until she was your slave. You implanted in her doubts of her husband. She discovered first that he was deceiving her, then, under your guidance, that he was trying to poison her. You were often at the house. You had opportunities to introduce the arsenic into her food, but you were careful never to do so when her husband was away. Being a woman, she did not keep her suspicions to herself. She talked to her niece. Doubtless she talked to other women friends. Your only difficulty was keeping up separate relations with the 2 women, and even that was not so difficult as it looked. You explained to the aunt that, to allay the suspicions of her husband, you had to pretend to pay court to the niece. And the younger lady needed little convincing. She would never seriously consider her aunt as a rival. But then Mrs. Pengelly made up her mind, without saying anything to you, to consult me. If she could be really assured, beyond any possible doubt, that her husband was trying to poison her, she would feel justified in leaving him, and linking her life with yours, which is what she imagined you wanted her to do. But that did not suit your book at all. You did not want a detective prying around. A favourable minute occurs. You are in the house when Mr. Pengelly is getting some gruel for his wife, and you introduce the fatal dose. The rest is easy. Apparently anxious to hush matters up, you secretly ferment them. But you reckoned without Hercule Poirot, my intelligent young friend. Radnor was deadly pale, but he still endeavoured to carry off matters with a high hand. "Very interesting and ingenious, but why tell me all this?" "Because, monsieur, I represent, not the law, but Mrs. Pengelly. For her sake, I give you a chance of escape. Sign this paper, and you shall have 24 hours' start. 24 hours before I place it in the hands of the police." Radnor hesitated. "You can't prove anything." "Can't I? I am Hercule Poirot. Look out of the window, monsieur. There are 2 men in the street. They have orders not to lose sight of you." Radnor strode across to the window and pulled aside the blind, then shrank back with an oath. "You see, monsieur, sign. It is your best chance." "What guarantee have I—" "That I shall keep faith? The word of Hercule Poirot? You will sign? Good. Hastings, be so kind as to pull that left-hand blind halfway up. That is the signal that Mr. Radnor may leave unmolested." White, muttering oaths, Radnor hurried from the room. Poirot nodded gently. "A coward! I always knew it." "It seems to me, Poirot, that you've acted in a criminal manner," I cried angrily. "You always preach against sentiment, and here you are letting a dangerous criminal escape out of sheer sentimentality." "That was not sentiment. That was business," replied Poirot. "Do you not see, my friend, that we have no shadow of proof against him? Shall I get up and say to 12 stolid Cornishmen that I, Hercule Poirot, know? They would laugh at me. The only chance was to frighten him and get a confession that way. Those 2 loafers that I noticed outside came in very useful. Pull down the blind again, will you, Hastings? Not that there was any reason for raising it. It was part of our mise en scène. Well, well, we must keep our word. 24 hours, did I say? So much longer for poor Mr. Pengelly, and it is not more than he deserves, for mark you, he deceived his wife. I am very strong on the family life, as you know. Well, 24 hours, and then I have great faith in Scotland Yard. They will get him, mon ami, they will get him. The Chocolate Box offers a unique look into Hercule Poirot's earlier years as a detective in Belgium. The story is significant because it is one of the few instances where Poirot admits to a failure in his career. Published in 1923, it reflects Agatha Christie's fascination with the psychology of crime, a theme she would explore throughout her career. The tale also highlights Christie's clever use of seemingly trivial details, like the mismatched colours of a chocolate box, to drive the narrative. This story showcases Christie's ability to blend mystery with deeper reflections on human nature and the fallibility of even the greatest minds. Agatha Christie, The Chocolate Box. It was a wild night. Outside, the wind howled malevolently, and the rain beat against the windows in great gusts. Poirot and I sat facing the hearth, our legs stretched out to the cheerful blaze. Between us was a small table. On my side of it stood some carefully brewed hot toddy. On Poirot's was a cup of thick, rich chocolate which I would not have drunk for £100. Poirot sipped the thick brown mess in the pink china cup, and sighed with contentment. "Quelle belle vie," he murmured. "Yes, it's a good old world," I agreed. "Here am I with a job, and a good job too. And here are you, famous." "Oh, mon ami," protested Poirot. "But you are, and rightly so. When I think back on your long line of successes, I am positively amazed. I don't believe you know what failure is. You would be a droll kind of original who could say that. No, but seriously, have you ever failed?" "Innumerable times, my friend. What would you? La bonne chance, it cannot always be on your side. I have been called in too late. Very often another, working towards the same goal, has arrived there first. Twice have I been stricken down with illness just as I was on the point of success. One must take the downs with the ups, my friend." "I didn't quite mean that," I said. "I meant, had you ever been completely down and out over a case through your own fault?" "Ah, I comprehend. You ask if I have ever made the complete prize ass of myself, as you say over here. Once, my friend." A slow, reflective smile hovered over his face. "Yes, once I made a fool of myself." He sat up suddenly in his chair. "See here, my friend. You have, I know, kept a record of my little successes. You shall add one more story to the collection, the story of a failure." He leaned forward and placed a log on the fire. Then, after carefully wiping his hands on a little duster that hung on a nail by the fireplace, he leaned back and commenced his story. "That of which I tell you," said Monsieur Poirot, "took place in Belgium many years ago. It was at the time of the terrible struggle in France between church and state. Monsieur Paul Déroulard was a French deputy of note. It was an open secret that the portfolio of a minister awaited him. He was among the bitterest of the anti-Catholic party, and it was certain that on his accession to power he would have to face violent enmity. He was in many ways a peculiar man. Though he neither drank nor smoked, he was nevertheless not so scrupulous in other ways. You comprehend, Hastings, c'était des femmes, toujours des femmes. He had married some years earlier a young lady from Brussels who had brought him a substantial dot. Undoubtedly the money was useful to him in his career, as his family was not rich, though on the other hand he was entitled to call himself Monsieur le Baron if he chose. There were no children of the marriage, and his wife died after 2 years, the result of a fall downstairs. Among the property which she bequeathed to him was a house on the Avenue Louise in Brussels. It was in this house that his sudden death took place, the event coinciding with the resignation of the minister whose portfolio he was to inherit. All the papers printed long notices of his career. His death, which had taken place quite suddenly in the evening after dinner, was attributed to heart failure. At that time, mon ami, I was, as you know, a member of the Belgian detective force. The death of Monsieur Paul Déroulard was not particularly interesting to me. I am, as you also know, bon catholique, and his demise seemed to me fortunate. It was some 3 days afterwards, when my vacation had just begun, that I received a visitor at my own apartments, a lady, Hevel. Veiled, but evidently quite young, and I perceived at once that she was a jeune fille tout à fait comme il faut. "You are Monsieur Hercule Poirot?" she asked in a low, sweet voice. I bowed. "Of the detective service." Again I bowed. "Be seated, I pray of you, mademoiselle," I said. She accepted a chair and drew aside her veil. Her face was charming, though marred with tears, and haunted as though with some poignant anxiety. "Monsieur," she said, "I understand that you are now taking a vacation. Therefore you will be free to take up a private case. You understand that I do not wish to call in the police." I shook my head. "I fear what you ask is impossible, mademoiselle. Even though on vacation, I am still of the police." She leaned forward. "Écoutez, monsieur. All that I ask of you is to investigate. The result of your investigations you are at perfect liberty to report to the police. If what I believe to be true is true, we shall need all the machinery of the law." That placed a somewhat different complexion on the matter, and I placed myself at her service without more ado. A slight colour rose in her cheeks. "I thank you, monsieur. It is the death of Monsieur Paul Déroulard that I ask you to investigate." "Comment!" I exclaimed, surprised. "Monsieur, I have nothing to go upon, nothing but my woman's instinct, but I am convinced, I tell you, that Monsieur Déroulard did not die a natural death." "But surely the doctors—" "Doctors may be mistaken. He was so robust, so strong. Ah, Monsieur Poirot, I beseech of you to help me." The poor child was almost beside herself. She would have knelt to me. I soothed her as best I could. "I will help you, mademoiselle. I feel almost sure that your fears are unfounded, but we will see. First, I will ask you to describe to me the inmates of the house." "There are the domestics, of course, Jeannette, Felice, and Denise the cook. She has been there many years. The others are simple country girls. Also there is François, but he too is an old servant. Then there is Monsieur Déroulard's mother, who lived with him, and myself. My name is Virginie Ménard. I am a poor cousin of the late Madame Déroulard, Monsieur Paul's wife, and I have been a member of their ménage for over 3 years. I have now described to you the household. There were also 2 guests staying in the house." And they were Monsieur de Saint-Alard, a neighbour of Monsieur Déroulard's in France, also an English friend, Mr. John Wilson. "Are they still with you?" "Mr. Wilson, yes, but Monsieur de Saint-Alard departed yesterday." "And what is your plan, Mademoiselle Mesnard? If you will present yourself at the house in half an hour's time, I will have arranged some story to account for your presence. I had better represent you to be connected with journalism in some way. I shall say you have come from Paris, and that you have brought a card of introduction from Monsieur de Saint-Alard. Madame Déroulard is very feeble in health, and will pay little attention to details." On Mademoiselle's ingenious pretext, I was admitted to the house, and after a brief interview with the dead deputy's mother, who was a wonderfully imposing and aristocratic figure, though obviously in failing health, I was made free of the premises. "I wonder, my friend," continued Poirot, "whether you can possibly figure to yourself the difficulties of my task. Here was a man whose death had taken place 3 days previously. If there had been foul play, only one possibility was admissible: poison. And I had no chance of seeing the body, and there was no possibility of examining or analyzing any medium in which the poison could have been administered. There were no clues, false or otherwise, to consider. Had the man been poisoned? Had he died a natural death? I, Hercule Poirot, with nothing to help me, had to decide. First I interviewed the domestics, and with their aid I recapitulated the evening. I paid especial notice to the food at dinner and the method of serving it. The soup had been served by Monsieur Déroulard himself from a tureen. Next a dish of cutlets, then a chicken. Finally a compote of fruits, and all placed on the table, and served by Monsieur himself. The coffee was brought in a big pot to the dinner table. Nothing there, mon ami. Impossible to poison one without poisoning all. After dinner, Madame Deroulard had retired to her own apartments, and Mademoiselle Virginie had accompanied her. The three men had adjourned to Monsieur Deroulard's study. Here they had chatted amicably for some time, when suddenly, without any warning, the deputy had fallen heavily to the ground. Monsieur de Saint-Allard had rushed out and told Francois to fetch the doctor immediately. He said it was without doubt an apoplexy, explained the man. But when the doctor arrived, the patient was past help. Mr. John Wilson, to whom I was presented by Mademoiselle Virginie, was what was known in those days as a regular John Bull Englishman, middle-aged and burly. His account, delivered in very British French, was substantially the same. Deroulard went very red in the face, and down he fell. There was nothing further to be found out there. Next, I went to the scene of the tragedy, the study, and was left alone there at my own request. So far, there was nothing to support Mademoiselle Mesnard's theory. I could not but believe that it was a delusion on her part. Evidently she had entertained a romantic passion for the dead man, which had not permitted her to take a normal view of the case. Nevertheless, I searched the study with meticulous care. It was just possible that a hypodermic needle might have been introduced into the dead man's chair in such a way as to allow of a fatal injection. The minute puncture it would cause was likely to remain unnoticed. But I could discover no sign to support the theory. I flung myself down in the chair with a gesture of despair. "Enfin, I abandon it," I said aloud. "There is not a clue anywhere. Everything is perfectly normal." As I said the words, my eyes fell on a large box of chocolates standing on a table nearby, and my heart gave a leap. It might not be a clue to Monsieur Deroulard's death, but here at least was something that was not normal. I lifted the lid. The box was full, untouched. Not a chocolate was missing, but that only made the peculiarity that had caught my eye more striking. For, see you, Hastings, while the box itself was pink, the lid was blue. Now, one often sees a blue ribbon on a pink box, and vice versa, but a box of one colour and a lid of another. No, decidedly, ça ne se voit jamais. I did not as yet see that this little incident was of any use to me, yet I determined to investigate it as being out of the ordinary. I rang the bell for Francois and asked him if his late master had been fond of sweets. A faint, melancholy smile came to his lips. "Passionately fond of them, monsieur. He would always have a box of chocolates in the house. He did not drink wine of any kind, you see. Yet this box has not been touched." I lifted the lid to show him. "Pardon, monsieur, but that was a new box purchased on the day of his death, the other being nearly finished." "Then the other box was finished on the day of his death," I said slowly. "Yes, monsieur. I found it empty in the morning and threw it away." "Did Monsieur Deroulard eat sweets at all hours of the day?" "Usually after dinner, monsieur." I began to see light. "Francois," I said, "you can be discreet." "If there is need, monsieur." "Bon. Know then that I am of the police. Can you find me that other box?" "Without doubt, monsieur. It will be in the dustbin." He departed, and returned in a few minutes with a dust-covered object. It was the duplicate of the box I held, save for the fact that this time the box was blue and the lid was pink. I thanked Francois, recommended him once more to be discreet, and left the house in the Avenue Louise without more ado. Next I call, led upon the doctor who had attended Monsieur Deroulard. With him I had a difficult task. He entrenched himself prettily behind a wall of learned phraseology, but I fancied that he was not quite as sure about the case as he would like to be. "There have been many curious occurrences of the kind," he observed, when I had managed to disarm him somewhat. "A sudden fit of anger, a violent emotion, after a heavy dinner, c'est entendu. Then, with an access of rage, the blood flies to the head, and psst, there you are." But Monsieur Deroulard had had no violent emotion. "No. I made sure that he had been having a stormy altercation with Monsieur de Saint-Allard." "Why should he?" "C'est évident." The doctor shrugged his shoulders. Was not Monsieur de Saint-Alard a Catholic of the most fanatical? Their friendship was being ruined by this question of church and state. Not a day passed without discussions. To Monsieur de Saint-Alard, Déroulard appeared almost as Antichrist. This was unexpected and gave me food for thought. One more question, Doctor. Would it be possible to introduce a fatal dose of poison into a chocolate? It would be possible, I suppose, said the doctor slowly. Pure prussic acid would meet the case if there were no chance of evaporation, and a tiny globule of anything might be swallowed unnoticed. But it does not seem a very likely supposition. A chocolate full of morphine or strychnine. He made a wry face. You comprehend, Monsieur Poirot. One bite would be enough. The unwary one would not stand upon ceremony. Thank you, Monsieur le Docteur. I withdrew. Next I made inquiries of the chemists, especially those in the neighbourhood of the Avenue Louise. It is good to be of the police. I got the information I wanted without any trouble. Only in one case could I hear of any poison having been supplied to the house in question. This was some eye drops of atropine sulfate for Madame Déroulard. Atropine is a potent poison, and for the moment I was elated. But the symptoms of atropine poisoning are closely allied to those of ptomaine, and bear no resemblance to those I was studying. Besides, the prescription was an old one. Madame Déroulard had suffered from cataracts in both eyes for many years. I was turning away discouraged when the chemist's voice called me back. Un moment, Monsieur Poirot. I remember the girl who brought that prescription, she said something about having to go on to the English chemist. You might try there. I did. Once more enforcing my official status, I got the information I wanted. On the day before Monsieur Déroulard's death, they had made up a prescription for Mr. John Wilson. Not that there was any making up about it. They were simply little tablets of trinitrine. I asked if I might see some. He showed me them, and my heart beat faster, for the tiny tablets were of chocolate. Is it a poison? I asked. No, monsieur. Can you describe to me its effect? It lowers the blood pressure. It is given for some forms of heart trouble, angina pectoris, for instance. It relieves the arterial tension. In arteriosclerosis. I interrupted him. Ma foi, this rigmarole says nothing to me. Does it cause the face to flush? Certainly it does. And supposing I ate 10, 20 of your little tablets, what then? I should not advise you to attempt it, he replied dryly. And yet you say it is not poison? There are many things not called poison which can kill a man, he replied as before. I left the shop elated. At last, things had begun to march. I now knew that John Wilson had the means for the crime. But what about the motive? He had come to Belgium on business, and had asked Monsieur Déroulard, whom he knew slightly, to put him up. There was apparently no way in which Déroulard's death could benefit him. Moreover, I discovered by inquiries in England that he had suffered for some years from that painful form of heart disease known as angina. Therefore he had a genuine right to have those tablets in his possession. Nevertheless, I was convinced that someone had gone to the chocolate box, opening the full one first by mistake, and had abstracted the contents of the last chocolate, cramming in instead as many little trinitrine tablets as it would hold. The chocolates were large ones. Between 20 or 30 tablets, I felt sure, could have been inserted. But who had done this? There were 2 guests in the house. John Wilson had the means. Saint-Alard had the motive. Remember, he was a fanatic, and there is no fanatic like a religious fanatic. Could he, by any means, have got hold of John Wilson's trinitrine? Another little idea came to me. Ah, you smile at my little ideas. Why had Wilson run out of trinitrine? Surely he would bring an adequate supply from England. I called once more at the house in the Avenue Louise. Wilson was out, but I saw the girl who did his room, Felice. I demanded of her immediately whether it was not true that Monsieur Wilson had lost a bottle from his washstand some little time ago. The girl responded eagerly. It was quite true. She, Felice, had been blamed for it. The English gentleman had evidently thought that she had broken it, and did not like to say so, whereas she had never even touched it. Without doubt it was Jeanette, always nosing round where she had no business to be. I calmed the flow of words and took my leave. I knew now all that I wanted to know. It remained for me to prove my case. That, I felt, would not be easy. I might be sure that St. Allard had removed the bottle of trinitrine from John Wilson's washstand, but to convince others I would have to produce evidence, and I had none to produce. Never mind. I knew. That was the great thing. You remember our difficulty in the Styles case, Hastings. There again I knew, but it took me a long time to find the last link which made my chain of evidence against the murderer complete. I asked for an interview with Mademoiselle Maynard. She came at once. I demanded of her the address of Monsieur de Saint-Allard. A look of trouble came over her face. "Why do you want it, monsieur?" "Mademoiselle, it is necessary." She seemed doubtful, troubled. "He can tell you nothing. He is a man whose thoughts are not in this world. He hardly notices what goes on around him." "Possibly, mademoiselle. Nevertheless, he was an old friend of Monsieur Deroulard's. There may be things he can tell me, things of the past, old grudges, old love affairs." The girl flushed and bit her lip. "As you please. But I feel sure now that I have been mistaken. It was good of you to accede to my demand, but I was upset, almost distraught at the time. I see now that there is no mystery to solve. Leave it, I beg of you, monsieur." I eyed her closely. "Mademoiselle," I said, "it is sometimes difficult for a dog to find a scent, but once he has found it, nothing on earth will make him leave it. That is if he is a good dog, and I, mademoiselle, I, Hercule Poirot, am a very good dog." Without a word she turned away. A few minutes later she returned with the address written on a sheet of paper. I left the house. Francois was waiting for me outside. He looked at me anxiously. "There is no news, monsieur?" "None as yet, my friend." "Ah, pauvre Monsieur Deroulard," he sighed. "I too was of his way of thinking. I do not care for priests. Not that I would say so in the house. The women are all devout. A good thing, perhaps. Madame est très pieuse, et Mademoiselle Virginie aussi." Mademoiselle Virginie? Was she très pieuse? Thinking of the tear-stained, passionate face I had seen that first day, I wondered. Having obtained the address of Monsieur de Saint-Allard, I wasted no time. I arrived in the neighbourhood of his chateau in the Ardennes, but it was some days before I could find a pretext for gaining admission to the house. In the end I did. How do you think? As a plumber, mon ami. It was the affair of a moment to arrange a neat little gas leak in his bedroom. I departed for my tools, and took care to return with them at an hour when I knew I should have the field pretty well to myself. What I was searching for, I hardly knew. The one thing needful, I could not believe there was any chance of finding. He would never have run the risk of keeping it. Still, when I found the little cupboard above the washstand locked, I could not resist the temptation of seeing what was inside it. The lock was quite a simple one to pick. The door swung open. It was full of old bottles. I took them up one by one with a trembling hand. Suddenly, I uttered a cry. Figure to yourself, my friend, I held in my hand a little phial with an English chemist's label. On it were the words, "Trinitrine tablets, one to be taken when required. Mr. John Wilson." I controlled my emotion, closed the cupboard, slipped the bottle into my pocket, and continued to repair the gas leak. One must be methodical. Then I left the chateau, and took train for my own country as soon as possible. I arrived in Brussels late that night. I was writing out a report for the préfet in the morning when a note was brought to me. It was from old Madame Deroulard, and it summoned me to the house in the Avenue Louise without delay. Francois opened the door to me. "Madame la Baronne is awaiting you." He conducted me to her apartments. She sat in state in a large armchair. There was no sign of Mademoiselle Virginie. "Monsieur Poirot," said the old lady, "I have just learned that you are not what you pretend to be. You are a police officer." "That is so, madam." "You came here to inquire into the circumstances of my son's death." Again I replied, "That is so, madame." "I should be glad if you would tell me what progress you have made." I hesitated. First, I would like to know how you have learned all this, madam. From one who is no longer of this world. Her words, and the brooding way she uttered them, sent a chill to my heart. I was incapable of speech. Therefore, monsieur, I would beg of you most urgently to tell me exactly what progress you have made in your investigation. Madame, my investigation is finished. My son was killed deliberately. You know by whom? Yes, madame. Who then? Monsieur de Saint-Allard. You are wrong. Monsieur de Saint-Allard is incapable of such a crime. The proofs are in my hands. I beg of you once more to tell me all. This time I obeyed, going over each step that had led me to the discovery of the truth. She listened attentively. At the end, she nodded her head. Yes, it is all as you say, all but one thing. It was not Monsieur de Saint-Allard who killed my son. It was I, his mother. I stared at her. She continued to nod her head gently. It is well that I sent for you. It is the providence of the good God that Virginie told me before she departed for the convent what she had done. Listen, Monsieur Poirot, my son was an evil man. He persecuted the church. He led a life of mortal sin. He dragged down the other souls beside his own, but there was worse than that. As I came out of my room in this house one morning, I saw my daughter-in-law standing at the head of the stairs. She was reading a letter. I saw my son steal up behind her, one swift push, and she fell, striking her head on the marble steps. When they picked her up, she was dead. My son was a murderer, and only I, his mother, knew it. She closed her eyes for a moment. You cannot conceive, monsieur, of my agony, my despair. What was I to do? Denounce him to the police? I could not bring myself to do it. It was my duty, but my flesh was weak. Besides, would they believe me? My eyesight had been failing for some time. They would say I was mistaken. I kept silence, but my conscience gave me no peace. By keeping silence, I too was a murderer. My son inherited his wife's money. He flourished as the green bay tree, and now he was to have a minister's portfolio. His persecution of the church would be redoubled. And there was Virginie. She, poor child, beautiful, naturally pious, was fascinated by him. He had a strange and terrible power over women. I saw it coming. I was powerless to prevent it. He had no intention of marrying her. The time came when she was ready to yield everything to him. Then I saw my path clear. He was my son. I had given him life. I was responsible for him. He had killed one woman's body. Now he would kill another's soul. I went to Mr. Wilson's room and took the bottle of tablets. He had once said laughingly that there were enough in it to kill a man. I went into the study and opened the big box of chocolates that always stood on the table. I opened a new box by mistake. The other was on the table also. There was just one chocolate left in it. That simplified things. No one ate chocolates except my son and Virginie. I would keep her with me that night. All went as I had planned. She paused, closing her eyes a minute, then opened them again. Monsieur Poirot, I am in your hands. They tell me I have not many days to live. I am willing to answer for my action before the good God. Must I answer for it on earth also? I hesitated. But the empty bottle, madame, I said to gain time. How came that into Monsieur de Saint-Allard's possession? When he came to say goodbye to me, monsieur, I slipped it into his pocket. I did not know how to get rid of it. I am so infirm that I cannot move about much without help, and finding it empty in my rooms might have caused suspicion. You understand, monsieur. She drew herself up to her full height. It was with no idea of casting suspicion on Monsieur de Saint-Allard. I never dreamed of such a thing. I thought his valet would find an empty bottle and throw it away without question. I bowed my head. I comprehend, madame, I said. And your decision, monsieur? Her voice was firm and unfaltering, her head held as high as ever. I rose to my feet. Madame, I said, I have the honour to wish you good day. I have made my investigations, and failed. The matter is closed. He was silent for a moment, then said quietly, She died just a week later. Mademoiselle Virginie passed through her novitiate and duly took the veil. That, my friend, is the story. I must admit that I do not make a fine figure in it. But that was hardly a failure, I expostulated. What else could you have thought under the circumstances? Ah, sacré, mon ami, cried Poirot, becoming suddenly animated. Is it that you do not see? But I was 36 times an idiot. My grey cells, they functioned not at all. The whole time I had the clue in my hands. What clue? The chocolate box. Do you not see? Would anyone in possession of their full eyesight make such a mistake? I knew Madame de Roulard had cataracts. The atropine drops told me that. There was only one person in the household whose eyesight was such that she could not see which lid to replace. It was the chocolate box that started me on the track, and yet up to the end I failed consistently to perceive its real significance. Also, my psychology was at fault. Had Monsieur de Saint-Allard been the criminal, he would never have kept an incriminating bottle. Finding it was a proof of his innocence. I had learned already from Mademoiselle Virginie that he was absent-minded. Altogether, it was a miserable affair that I have recounted to you there. Only to you have I told the story. You comprehend I do not figure well in it. An old lady commits a crime in such a simple and clever fashion that I, Hercule Poirot, am completely deceived. Sapristi, it does not bear thinking of. Forget it. Or no, remember it, and if you think at any time that I am growing conceited, it is not likely, but it might arise. I concealed a smile. Eh bien, my friend, you shall say to me, chocolate box. Is it agreed? It's a bargain. After all, said Poirot reflectively, it was an experience. I, who have undoubtedly the finest brain in Europe at present, can afford to be magnanimous. Chocolate box, I murmured gently. Pardon, mon ami. I looked at Poirot's innocent face as he bent forward inquiringly, and my heart smote me. I had suffered often at his hands, but I too, though not possessing the finest brain in Europe, could afford to be magnanimous. Nothing, I lied, and lit another pipe, smiling to myself. The Mystery of Hunter's Lodge first appeared in 1923, a time when Agatha Christie was solidifying her reputation as a master of the detective genre. This story is notable for its clever use of misdirection, a hallmark of Christie's writing. It also showcases her ability to build suspense by playing with the reader's expectations. The remote, isolated setting of Hunter's Lodge adds to the story's atmosphere of suspense and danger, a common feature in Christie's work that heightens the sense of claustrophobia and tension. Interestingly, this story also highlights Poirot's ability to solve cases even when he is physically removed from the scene, emphasizing his reliance on intellect over action. Agatha Christie, The Mystery of Hunter's Lodge. After all, murmured Poirot, it is possible that I shall not die this time. Coming from a convalescent influenza patient, I hailed the remark as showing a beneficial optimism. I myself had been the first sufferer from the disease. Poirot, in his turn, had gone down. He was now sitting up in bed, propped up with pillows, his head muffled in a woolen shawl, and was slowly sipping a particularly noxious tisane which I had prepared according to his directions. His eye rested with pleasure upon a neatly graduated row of medicine bottles which adorned the mantelpiece. Yes, yes, my little friend continued. Once more shall I be myself again, the great Hercule Poirot, the terror of evil-doers. Figure to yourself, mon ami, that I have a little paragraph to myself in society gossip, but yes, here it is. Go it. Criminals all out. Hercule Poirot, and believe me, girls, he's some Hercules. Our own pet society detective can't get a grip on you. 'Cause why? 'Cause he's got la grippe himself. I laughed. Good for you, Poirot. You are becoming quite a public character. And fortunately, you haven't missed anything of particular interest during this time. That is true. The few cases I have had to decline did not fill me with any regret. Our landlady stuck her head in at the door. There's a gentleman downstairs. Says he must see Monsieur Poirot or you, Captain. Seeing as he was in a great to-do, and with all that quite the gentleman, I brought up his card. She handed me the bit of pasteboard. Mr. Roger Havering, I read. Poirot motioned with his head towards the bookcase, and I obediently pulled forth Who's Who. Poirot took it from me and scanned the pages rapidly. Second son of 5th Baron Windsor, married 1913 Zoe, 4th daughter of William Crabbe. I said. I rather fancy that's the girl who used to act at the Frivolity. Only she called herself Zoe Carisbrook. I remember she married some young man about town just before the war. Would it interest you, Hastings, to go down and hear what our visitor's particular little trouble is? Make him all my excuses. Roger Havering was a man of about 40, well set up and of smart appearance. His face, however, was haggard, and he was evidently labouring under great agitation. Captain Hastings, you are Monsieur Poirot's partner, I understand. It is imperative that he should come with me to Derbyshire today. I'm afraid that's impossible, I replied. Poirot is ill in bed. Influenza. His face fell. Dear me, that is a great blow to me. The matter on which you want to consult him is serious. My God, yes. My uncle, the best friend I have in the world, was foully murdered last night. Here in London? No, in Derbyshire. I was in town and received a telegram from my wife this morning. Immediately upon its receipt, I determined to come round and beg Monsieur Poirot to undertake the case. If you will excuse me a minute, I said, struck by a sudden idea. I rushed upstairs and in a few brief words acquainted Poirot with the situation. He took any further words out of my mouth. I see. You want to go yourself, is it not so? Well, why not? You should know my methods by now. All I ask is that you should report to me fully every day and follow implicitly any instructions I may wire you. To this I willingly agreed. An hour later I was sitting opposite Mr. Havering in a first-class carriage on the Midland Railway, speeding rapidly away from London. To begin with, Captain Hastings, you must understand that Hunter's Lodge, where we are going, and where the tragedy took place, is only a small shooting box in the heart of the Derbyshire moors. Our real home is near Newmarket, and we usually rent a flat in town for the season. Hunter's Lodge is looked after by a housekeeper who is quite capable of doing all we need when we run down for an occasional weekend. Of course, during the shooting season, we take down some of our own servants from Newmarket. My uncle, Mr. Harrington Pace, as you may know, my mother was a Miss Pace of New York, has, for the last 3 years, made his home with us. He never got on well with my father or my elder brother, and I suspect that my being somewhat of a prodigal son myself rather increased than diminished his affection towards me. Of course I am a poor man, and my uncle was a rich one. In other words, he paid the piper. But, though exacting in many ways, he was not really hard to get on with, and we all three lived very harmoniously together. 2 days ago my uncle, rather wearied with some recent gaieties of ours in town, suggested that we should run down to Derbyshire for a day or two. My wife telegraphed to Mrs. Middleton, the housekeeper, and we went down that same afternoon. Yesterday evening I was forced to return to town, but my wife and my uncle remained on. This morning I received this telegram. He handed it over to me. Come at once. Uncle Harrington murdered last night. Bring good detective if you can, but do come. Zoe. Then as yet you know no details? No, I suppose it will be in the evening papers. Without doubt the police are in charge. It was about 3 o'clock when we arrived at the little station of Elmersdale. From there a 5-mile drive brought us to a small grey stone building in the midst of the rugged moors. A lonely place, I observed with a shiver. Havering nodded. I shall try and get rid of it. I could never live here again. We unlatched the gate and were walking up the narrow path to the oak door when a familiar figure emerged and came to meet us. Jap! I ejaculated. The Scotland Yard inspector grinned at me in a friendly fashion before addressing my companion. Mr. Havering, I think. I've been sent down from London to take charge of this case, and I'd like a word with you, if I may, sir. My wife? I've seen your good lady, sir, and the housekeeper. I won't keep you a moment, but I'm anxious to get back to the village now that I've seen all there is to see here. I know nothing as yet as to what— "Exactly," said Japp soothingly. "But there are just one or two little points I'd like your opinion about all the same. Captain Hastings here, he knows me, and he'll go on up to the house and tell them you're coming. What have you done with the little man, by the way, Captain Hastings?" "He's ill in bed with influenza." "Is he now? I'm sorry to hear that. Rather the case of the cart without the horse. Your being here without him, isn't it?" And on his rather ill-timed jest, I went on to the house. I rang the bell, as Japp had closed the door behind him. After some moments it was opened to me by a middle-aged woman in black. "Mr. Havering will be here in a moment," I explained. "He has been detained by the inspector. I have come down with him from London to look into the case. Perhaps you can tell me briefly what occurred last night." "Come inside, sir." She closed the door behind me, and we stood in the dimly lighted hall. "It was after dinner last night, sir, that the man came. He asked to see Mr. Pace, sir, and seeing that he spoke the same way, I thought it was an American gentleman friend of Mr. Pace's, and I showed him into the gun-room, and then went to tell Mr. Pace. He wouldn't give any name, which of course was a bit odd, now I come to think of it. I told Mr. Pace, and he seemed puzzled like, but he said to the mistress, 'Excuse me, Zoe, while I just see what this fellow wants.' He went off to the gun-room, and I went back to the kitchen, but after a while I heard loud voices, as if they were quarrelling, and I came out into the hall. At the same time, the mistress she comes out too, and just then there was a shot, and then a dreadful silence. We both ran to the gun-room door, but it was locked, and we had to go round to the window. It was open, and there inside was Mr. Pace, all shot and bleeding. What became of the man? He must have got away through the window, sir, before we got to it. And then? Mrs. Havering sent me to fetch the police. 5 miles to walk it was. They came back with me, and the constable he stayed all night, and this morning the police gentleman from London arrived. What was this man like who called to see Mr. Pace? The housekeeper reflected. He had a black beard, sir, and was about middle-aged, and had on a light overcoat. Beyond the fact that he spoke like an American, I didn't notice much about him. I see. Now I wonder if I can see Mrs. Havering. She's upstairs, sir. Shall I tell her? If you please, tell her that Mr. Havering is outside with Inspector Japp, and that the gentleman he has brought back with him from London is anxious to speak to her as soon as possible. Very good, sir. I was in a fever of impatience to get at all the facts. Japp had 2 or 3 hours' start of me, and his anxiety to be gone made me keen to be close at his heels. Mrs. Havering did not keep me waiting long. In a few minutes I heard a light step descending the stairs, and looked up to see a very handsome young woman coming towards me. She wore a flame-coloured jumper that set off the slender boyishness of her figure. On her dark head was a little hat of flame-coloured leather. Even the present tragedy could not dim the vitality of her personality. I introduced myself, and she nodded in quick comprehension. Of course, I have often heard of you and your colleague, Monsieur Poirot. You have done some wonderful things together, haven't you? It was very clever of my husband to get you so promptly. Now will you ask me questions? That is the easiest way, isn't it, of getting to know all you want to about this dreadful affair? Thank you, Mrs. Havering. Now what time was it that this man arrived? It must have been just before 9 o'clock. We had finished dinner, and were sitting over our coffee and cigarettes. Your husband had already left for London? Yes, he went up by the 6:15. Did he go by car to the station, or did he walk? Our own car isn't down here. One came out from the garage in Elmersdale to fetch him in time for the train. Was Mr. Pace quite his usual self? Absolutely, most normal in every way. Now, can you describe this visitor at all? I'm afraid not. I didn't see him. Mrs. Middleton showed him straight into the gun-room and then came to tell my uncle. What did your uncle say? He seemed rather annoyed, but went off at once. It was about 5 minutes later that I heard the sound of raised voices. I ran out into the hall and almost collided with Mrs. Middleton. Then we heard the shot. The gun-room door was locked on the inside, and we had to go right round the house to the window. Of course, that took some time, and the murderer had been able to get well away. My poor uncle, her voice faltered, had been shot through the head. I saw at once that he was dead, I sent Mrs. Middleton for the police. I was careful to touch nothing in the room but to leave it exactly as I found it. I nodded approval. Now, as to the weapon? Well, I can make a guess at it, Captain Hastings. A pair of revolvers of my husband's were mounted upon the wall. One of them is missing. I pointed this out to the police, and they took the other one away with them. When they have extracted the bullet, I suppose they will know for certain. May I go to the gun room? Certainly. The police have finished with it, but the body has been removed. She accompanied me to the scene of the crime. At that moment Havering entered the hall, and with a quick apology his wife ran to him. I was left to undertake my investigations alone. I may as well confess at once that they were rather disappointing. In detective novels clues abound, but here I could find nothing that struck me as out of the ordinary, except a large bloodstain on the carpet where I judged the dead man had fallen. I examined everything with painstaking care, and took a couple of pictures of the room with my little camera which I had brought with me. I also examined the ground outside the window, but it appeared to have been so heavily trampled underfoot that I judged it was useless to waste time over it. No, I had seen all that Hunter's Lodge had to show me. I must go back to Elmersdale and get into touch with Jap. Accordingly, I took leave of the Haverings and was driven off in the car that had brought us up from the station. I found Jap at the Matlock Arms, and he took me forthwith to see the body. Harrington Pace was a small, spare, clean-shaven man, typically American in appearance. He had been shot through the back of the head, and the revolver had been discharged at close quarters. "Turned away for a moment," remarked Jap, and the other fellow snatched up a revolver and shot him. The one Mrs. Havering handed over to us was fully loaded, and I suppose the other one was also. Curious what darn fool things people do. Fancy keeping 2 loaded revolvers hanging up on your wall. "What do you think of the case?" I asked as we left the gruesome chamber behind us. "Well, I'd got my eye on Havering to begin with." "Oh, yes," noting my exclamation of astonishment. "Havering has 1 or 2 shady incidents in his past. When he was a boy at Oxford, there was some funny business about the signature on one of his father's cheques. All hushed up, of course. Then he's pretty heavily in debt now, and they're the kind of debts he wouldn't like to go to his uncle about, whereas you may be sure the uncle's will would be in his favour. Yes, I'd got my eye on him, and that's why I wanted to speak to him before he saw his wife, but their statements dovetail all right, and I've been to the station, and there's no doubt whatever that he left by the 6:15. That gets up to London about 10:30. He went straight to his club, he says, and if that's confirmed all right, why, he couldn't have been shooting his uncle here at 9 o'clock in a black beard." Yes, I was going to ask you what you thought about that beard." Jap winked. "I think it grew pretty fast. Grew in the 5 miles from Elmersdale to Hunter's Lodge. Americans that I've met are mostly clean-shaven. Yes, it's amongst Mr. Pace's American associates that we'll have to look for the murderer. I questioned the housekeeper first, and then her mistress, and their stories agree all right. But I'm sorry Mrs. Havering didn't get a look at the fellow. She's a smart woman, and she might have noticed something that would set us on the track." I sat down and wrote a minute and lengthy account to Poirot. I was able to add various further items of information before I posted the letter. The bullet had been extracted, and was proved to have been fired from a revolver identical with the one held by the police. Furthermore, Mr. Havering's movements on the night in question had been checked and verified, and it was proved beyond doubt that he had actually arrived in London by the train in question. And thirdly, a sensational development had occurred. A city gentleman living at Ealing, on crossing Haven Green to get to the district railway station that morning, had observed a brown paper parcel stuck between the railings. Opening it, he found that it contained a revolver. He handed the parcel over to the local police station, and before night it was proved to be the one we were in search of, the fellow to that given us by Mrs. Havering. 1 bullet had been fired from it. All this I added to my report. A wire from Poirot arrived whilst I was at breakfast the following morning. Of course, black-bearded man was not Havering. Only you or Jap would have such an idea. Wire me description of housekeeper and what clothes she wore this morning. Same of Mrs. Havering. Do not waste time taking photographs of interiors. They are underexposed and not in the least artistic. It seemed to me that Poirot's style was unnecessarily facetious. I also fancied he was a shade jealous of my position on the spot with full facilities for handling the case. His request for a description of the clothes worn by the two women appeared to me to be simply ridiculous, but I complied as well as I, a mere man, was able to. At 11, a reply wire came from Poirot. Advise Japp arrest housekeeper before it is too late. Dumbfounded, I took the wire to Japp. He swore softly under his breath. He's the goods, Monsieur Poirot. If he says so, there's something in it. And I hardly noticed the woman. I don't know that I can go so far as arresting her, but I'll have her watched. We'll go up right away and take another look at her. But it was too late. Mrs. Middleton, that quiet, middle-aged woman who had appeared so normal and respectable, had vanished into thin air. Her box had been left behind. It contained only ordinary wearing apparel. There was no clue in it to her identity, or as to her whereabouts. From Mrs. Havering we elicited all the facts we could. I engaged her about 3 weeks ago when Mrs. Emery, our former housekeeper, left. She came to me from Mrs. Selborne's agency in Mount Street, a very well-known place. I get all my servants from there. They sent several women to see me, but this Mrs. Middleton seemed much the nicest and had splendid references. I engaged her on the spot and notified the agency of the fact. I can't believe that there was anything wrong with her. She was such a nice, quiet woman. The thing was certainly a mystery. Whilst it was clear that the woman herself could not have committed the crime, since at the moment the shot was fired, Mrs. Havering was with her in the hall, nevertheless, she must have some connection with the murder, or why should she suddenly take to her heels and bolt? I wired the latest development to Poirot and suggested returning to London and making inquiries at Selborne's agency. Poirot's reply was prompt. Useless to inquire at agency, they will never have heard of her. Find out what vehicle took her up to Hunter's Lodge when she first arrived there. Though mystified, I was obedient. The means of transport in Elmersdale were limited. The local garage had 2 battered Ford cars, and there were 2 station flys. None of these had been requisitioned on the date in question. Questioned, Mrs. Havering explained that she had given the woman the money for her fare down to Derbyshire, and sufficient to hire a car or fly to take her up to Hunter's Lodge. There was usually one of the Fords at the station on the chance of its being required. Taking into consideration the further fact that nobody at the station had noticed the arrival of a stranger, black-bearded or otherwise, on the fatal evening, everything seemed to point to the conclusion that the murderer had come to the spot in a car, which had been waiting near at hand to aid his escape, and that the same car had brought the mysterious housekeeper to her new post. I may mention that inquiries at the agency in London bore out Poirot's prognostication. No such woman as Mrs. Middleton had ever been on their books. They had received the Honourable Mrs. Havering's application for a housekeeper, and had sent her various applicants for the post. When she sent them the engagement fee, she omitted to mention which woman she had selected. Somewhat crestfallen, I returned to London. I found Poirot established in an armchair by the fire in a garish silk dressing-gown. He greeted me with much affection. "Mon ami Hastings! But how glad I am to see you. Veritably, I have for you a great affection. And you have enjoyed yourself? You have run to and fro with the good Japp? You have interrogated and investigated to your heart's content?" "Poirot," I cried, "the thing's a dark mystery. It will never be solved." "It is true that we are not likely to cover ourselves with glory over it." "No, indeed. It's a hard nut to crack." "Oh, as far as that goes, I am very good at cracking the nuts, a veritable squirrel. It is not that which embarrasses me. I know well enough who killed Mr. Harrington Pace." "You know? How did you find out?" "Your illuminating answers to my wires supplied me with the truth. See here, Hastings, let us examine the facts methodically and in order. Mr. Harrington Pace is a man with a considerable fortune, which at his death will doubtless pass to his nephew. Point number 1, his nephew is known to be desperately hard up. Point number 2, his nephew is also known to be, shall we say, a man of rather loose moral fibre. Point number 3, but Roger Havering is proved to have journeyed straight up to London. Précisément, and therefore, as Mr. Havering left Elmersdale at 6:15, and since Mr. Pace cannot have been killed before he left, or the doctor would have spotted the time of the crime as being given wrongly when he examined the body, we conclude quite rightly that Mr. Havering did not shoot his uncle. But there is a Mrs. Havering, Hastings. Impossible! The housekeeper was with her when the shot was fired. Ah, yes, the housekeeper, but she has disappeared. She will be found. I think not. There is something peculiarly elusive about that housekeeper. Don't you think so, Hastings? It struck me at once. She played her part, I suppose, and then got out in the nick of time. And what was her part? Well, presumably to admit her confederate, the black-bearded man. Oh, no, that was not her part. Her part was what you have just mentioned, to provide an alibi for Mrs. Havering at the moment the shot was fired, and no one will ever find her, mon ami, because she does not exist. There's no sec person, as your so great Shakespeare says. It was Dickens, I murmured, unable to suppress a smile. But what do you mean, Poirot? I mean that Zoe Havering was an actress before her marriage, that you and Japp only saw the housekeeper in a dark hall, a dim, middle-aged figure in black with a faint, subdued voice, and finally that neither you, nor Japp, nor the local police whom the housekeeper fetched, ever saw Mrs. Middleton and her mistress at one and the same time. It was child's play for that clever and daring woman. On the pretext of summoning her mistress, she runs upstairs, slips on a bright jumper and a hat with black curls attached, which she jams down over the grey transformation. A few deft touches and the makeup is removed, a slight dusting of rouge, and the brilliant Zoe Havering comes down with her clear, ringing voice. Nobody looks particularly at the housekeeper. Why should they? There is nothing to connect her with the crime. She, too, has an alibi. But the revolver that was found at Ealing, Mrs. Havering could not have placed it there. No, that was Roger Havering's job, but it was a mistake on their part. It put me on the right track. A man who has committed a murder with a revolver which he found on the spot would fling it away at once. He would not carry it up to London with him. No, the motive was clear. The criminals wished to focus the interest of the police on a spot far removed from Derbyshire. They were anxious to get the police away as soon as possible from the vicinity of Hunter's Lodge. Of course, the revolver found at Ealing was not the one with which Mr. Pace was shot. Roger Havering discharged one shot from it, brought it up to London, went straight to his club to establish his alibi, then went quickly out to Ealing by the district, a matter of about 20 minutes only, placed the parcel where it was found, and so back to town. That charming creature, his wife, quietly shoots Mr. Pace after dinner. You remember he was shot from behind? Another significant point that, reloads the revolver and puts it back in its place, and then starts off with her desperate little comedy. It's incredible, I murmured, fascinated. And yet it is true. Bien sûr, my friend, it is true. But to bring that precious pair to justice, that is another matter. Well, Japp must do what he can. I have written him fully. But I very much fear, Hastings, that we shall be obliged to leave them to fate, or le bon Dieu, whichever you prefer. The wicked flourish like a green bay tree, I reminded him. But at a price, Hastings. Always at a price, crois-moi. Poirot's forebodings were confirmed. Japp, though convinced of the truth of his theory, was unable to get together the necessary evidence to ensure a conviction. Mr. Pace's huge fortune passed into the hands of his murderers. Nevertheless, Nemesis did overtake them, and when I read in the paper that the Honour Roger and Mrs. Havering were amongst those killed in the crashing of the airmail to Paris, I knew that justice was satisfied.